Most of what we think we know about Q is downstream of a single scholarly tradition, one built on a document nobody has ever found. Command of. Let's pull on that thread. There's a problem at the heart of the first 3 New Testament books, Mark and Luke. The Synoptic Gospels share enormous stretches of material, sometimes word for word in the Greek. That level of agreement isn't coincidence. Somebody was reading somebody. The dominant scholarly explanation is that both Matthew and Luke independently drew on 2 written sources, Mark's Gospel and a second, lost document called Q, from the German Quelle, meaning source, has never been found. No manuscript, no fragment, no ancient reference to it by name. Yet, it's the organizing assumption of a major field of scholarship. This episode is about what the argument looks like from the inside, where it holds, where it strains, what we genuinely cannot know. The synoptic problem is the technical name for what happens when you lay Matthew, Mark, and Luke side by side, under the command of. The similarities are too precise to be explained by 3 independent authors writing about the same events. About 90% of Mark's content appears in Matthew, frequently in nearly identical Greek phrasing. Luke reproduces roughly half of Mark. That overlap, while striking, is the simpler piece to explain. One writer had access to the other, or both had access to a common source. The harder piece is what remains when you subtract Mark. Matthew and Luke share a substantial block of additional material, roughly 200 verses in most counts, that has no parallel in Mark at all. Almost all of it is sayings rather than narrative. The Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer in its extended form, the Mission Discourse, several parables that appear in both Gospels. It's a coherent body of material, and its distribution is strange. Matthew presents most of it in extended blocks, including the Sermon on the Mount. Luke scatters the same material across multiple chapters, without Matthew's organizational structure, under the command of. This divergence in arrangement is one of the main arguments for a shared written source sitting behind both Gospels. If Luke simply copied Matthew, you would expect him to at least sometimes preserve Matthew's organizational groupings. He largely doesn't. Theorists argue this makes more sense if both evangelists were independently drawing from a common document, each arranging its contents according to their own literary purposes. That argument is not unreasonable, but it rests on a prior assumption that Luke did not know Matthew. The entire case for Q depends on that assumption. The assumption is not provable from the texts themselves. If Q existed, it was a specific and unusual kind of document, not a gospel in the narrative sense. No birth account, no passion narrative, no resurrection. Almost entirely a sayings collection, attributed discourses, and aphorisms with minimal storytelling around them. This format has ancient parallels. The Book of Proverbs in the Hebrew Bible is a wisdom collection in roughly this form. Various Hellenistic philosophical schools circulated sayings attributed to their founders. Early Christian literature, the closest analogue, is the Gospel of Thomas, command of, a Coptic text found among a cache of manuscripts at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in the mid-20th century. Thomas is exactly what Q theorists imagine Q to have been: a list of sayings attributed to Jesus, with almost no narrative framing. Thomas's existence doesn't prove Q existed. Thomas is not Q. But it demonstrates that sayings Gospels circulated in early Christianity and could survive as independent documents. That's useful context for the hypothesis. Scholars who work with Q have attempted reconstructions of its content and even its internal structure. Running scholarly collaboration produced a critical edition of the reconstructed Q text. Roughly 230, 5 verses in one widely used count, and identified what they argued were distinct compositional layeric, a coherent theological outlook. Under the command of. The methodological note that belongs here: every word of that reconstruction is inference, was built by subtracting Mark from the shared Matthew, Luke material, and treating what remained as a recoverable document. Procedure works only if the source hypothesis is correct. Q scholarship has produced substantial literature about a text that may not exist. The most striking fact about Q is that no ancient writer appears to mention it. Not by that name, not by any description that clearly points to it. Early Christian writers were not reticent about discussing their sources. There is ancient commentary on Matthew's relationship to a Hebrew or Aramaic text, on the transmission of various gospel traditions, on the authority of eyewitness testimony, if Q was a major sayings source used independently by 2 evangelists, the silence around it is at least worth noting. Q theorists have responses to this. Lost documents from the ancient world are not unusual. The great majority of ancient writing has not survived, and a text can be influential without being explicitly cited. Matthew and Luke each used Q and incorporated all of it. Command of. There would be no orphan source text still circulating to attract comment. The silence around Q could simply mean it was fully absorbed and therefore invisible to later writers. This is a reasonable argument. It is also structurally unfalsifiable. Under the command of. You cannot demonstrate the existence of a document from the absence of references to it. The argument from silence runs both directions. No mention of Q could mean it was absorbed, under the command of, or it could mean there was nothing to mention because it never existed. Evidence actually shows is this Matthew, Mark, and Luke exist. They share material in ways that demand a literary explanation. Q is one explanation for a specific subset of that shared material. It is a hypothesis inferred from a pattern in the texts, not a discovery. The distinction matters because popular treatments, and some introductory scholarly ones, discuss Q as if it were a recovered text, when it remains an inference. The case against Q has never gone away, and in recent decades it has become more methodologically organized. Alternative to the source hypothesis is called the Farrer hypothesis, 20th century Oxford theologian. The proposal is economical. Mark wrote first. Matthew used Mark. Luke used both Mark and Matthew. In this scenario, the material Matthew and Luke's share comes not from a lost Q, but simply from Luke's use of Matthew. Luke's scattered arrangement of that material is not evidence of independent copying from a common source. It's evidence that Luke rearranged Matthew for his own literary purposes, which is attested behavior among ancient authors working with written sources. The Farrer hypothesis eliminates Q without requiring any additional documents. By standard principles of explanatory parsimony, it is the simpler hypothesis, if it can account for all the same evidence, and of Q. Q theorists respond that Luke's handling of the shared material is too systematically different from Matthew's to be plausibly explained by simple rearrangement. If Luke had Matthew in front of him, why would he so consistently break up Matthew's carefully constructed teaching blocks? The counter response: Luke had his own literary agenda, and restructuring sources to serve that agenda was exactly how ancient authors worked. Neither argument is decisive. A related pressure point for the two-source hypothesis is what scholars call the minor agreements, places where Matthew and Luke agree against Mark in their shared Markan material. If both evangelists independently used Mark, these agreements need explaining. Q theorists invoke scribal copying, variant Mark manuscripts, and incidental convergence. Of Q skeptics argue the cumulative number of these agreements is better explained by Luke knowing Matthew directly. The debate is substantive and unresolved. It is not a fringe versus mainstream fight. It is a real disagreement among serious scholars about what the evidence actually supports. Here is where the evidence actually leaves us, stripped of default assumptions, seem to me well established. The synoptic problem is real. The verbal agreements across Matthew, Mark, and Luke require a literary explanation, not just shared oral tradition. The position that Mark was written first, and that Matthew and Luke each used it, is the most defensible view of the relationship. The stylistic and structural arguments for it are strong. What's less established, and I think under-acknowledged in most introductory treatments, is the jump from Matthew and Luke shared additional material. 2. That material came from a specific document called Q. The two-source hypothesis is a plausible inference. The Farrer hypothesis is also a plausible inference. Both explain the data. The majority of working New Testament scholars prefer the two-source hypothesis, and that preference is based on serious argumentation. But the preference is not certainty. The Gospel of Thomas's existence, which post dates the development of the Q hypothesis but is now fully integrated into the discussion, does increase the prior probability of a saying's gospel source. It demonstrates the type existed and could circulate independently. That is genuinely useful evidence for the hypothesis. The two-source hypothesis is probably the best current explanation for the synoptic problem, but probably the best current explanation, and this document existed and we can reconstruct it, are two very different epistemic positions. The field sometimes writes as if it occupies the second when it can only claim the first. To be explicit about the limits, because the limits are the point. We do not know if Q existed. We have a pattern in the texts. The pattern requires explanation. Q is one coherent explanation. It is not the only one. If Q did exist, We do not know what language it was written in. Some scholars argue for Greek on the grounds that the Matthew, Luke verbal agreements are in Greek. Others have proposed an Aramaic original, perhaps translated more than once before reaching the evangelists. There is no manuscript evidence either way. We do not know Q's sequence. The scholarly reconstructions attempt to establish an ordering under the command of, but that ordering depends on contested assumptions about which evangelist preserved the more original arrangement. Different scholars argue for Matthew's order, others argue for Luke's. The reconstructed text is, in this sense, a scholarly construct built from disputed premises. We do not know whether Q was a single unified document or a looser collection of materials, multiple scrolls, oral performance traditions, local community sayings collections that Matthew and Luke accessed through different channels. The hypothesis imagines Q as a coherent document because that's the simplest inference. It may have been messier. We do not know why Q, if it existed and was used by two canonical Gospels, left no physical trace and no clear reference in any ancient text we have recovered. The available explanations are reasonable. None is decisive. Command of. And we do not know whether the community that scholars have inferred behind Q. A community sometimes, given a distinctive theology and social location, represents anything real, or whether it is a reconstruction built entirely on top of a hypothetical document. The literature about the Q community is extensive. The evidence for it is Q, and Q is itself inferred. The chain holds together, but it begins with inference, not ground. Pull back. The synoptic problem is real. Three texts share material in ways that demand a literary explanation. Source hypothesis, with Q at its center, is the dominant scholarly answer, built on careful attention to the texts and serious argumentation. But there's a meaningful difference between the best hypothesis we currently have and a document we've actually found. May be the most economical explanation. That doesn't make it a recovery. The absence of the text is not a footnote. Until next time.